with that, we'll go on to our next speaker, which is Rebecca Flitcroft. And she is a research fish biologist with the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station in Corvallis, Oregon. She has an MS in natural resource geography and a PhD in fisheries from Oregon State University. Her research explores holistic approaches to catchment, that is watershed analysis and management. And she's particularly interested in the relationships between disturbance processes and aquatic habitat. So we will hear now from Rebecca on river connectivity, which is a very timely topic for us everywhere, I think, where there are trout and salmon.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ray. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. And I am going to kick this off by just acknowledging a lot of the people whose vision and ideas helped contribute to much of the content that I'm going to present today. So, rivers. Rivers provide important connections at varying scales of organization. You know, at the national scale, large rivers like the Colorado, the Mississippi, or the Columbia characterize broad swaths of landscape. Within those rivers, and in the smaller rivers that ultimately drain to the sea, habitats for diverse assemblages of aquatic biota are present. So connection among and within habitats in these large and small riverscapes is crucial for the survival of aquatic biota. This seems like a no-brainer, right? How we think about connectivity in both space and time is the primary topic for this talk today. So rivers define and are defined by the landscapes in which they are embedded. So elevation, lithology, weather, and vegetation are all drivers of the configuration and types of aquatic habitat that is found in a river system. While the rivers across the country may look different because of the variability in all of these features, there are characteristics of rivers that are conceptually the same. So what are some of these concepts? Well, connectivity and the importance of connectivity for key species are key ones. So thoughtful scientists have been thinking about the concepts of connectivity and habitat organization in rivers for a very long time. A foundational piece of work was published by the Note in 1980. They set up a framework for thinking about how stream size and biological complexity along a gradient that was directly linked to where you were in the river system. So this river continuum concept continues to influence how we think about the organization of habitats and biota in rivers. Fursell contributed the hierarchical organization of habitats in 1986. So this linked the scale at which river habitats could be understood within the broader hierarchy of the river network itself. Bausch's riverscape concept in 2002 provided the perspective that the entire network is important to consider, particularly when assessing the distribution and availability of habitats. Benda contributed the network dynamics hypothesis in 2004 that pointed out the importance of tributary junctions as places of potentially higher habitat and biotic diversity, because this is the place of connection between materials like wood and sediment that would be washed downstream from headwater areas. So all of these concepts contribute to how we think about connection in rivers as one of hierarchical organization within a broader network of connections that are likely variable based on locally experienced disturbances. Through all this, water connects the river, and the physics of the water flow defines how habitats change over time, over long and short time periods. How rivers are configured, their basic shape, has been an important driver for thinking about how connectivity differs among systems. Coate contributed the concept of the dendritic connectivity index when thinking about the intersection between life histories of native fishes and prioritization of conservation and restoration actions. Much of the importance of river configuration is captured in biological interactions of dispersal. So fully aquatic biota like fishes are limited in their movement to the river corridor, making concepts such as movement and dispersal critical in understanding species-specific habitat connection and population scale viability. Aquatic biota use habitats throughout the continuum of a river system. In this example of a stream in the Pacific Northwest, habitat varies from the headwaters to the estuary. Where are these habitats located, and what are the characteristics of the river at that location? Is the river wide, or is it narrow? Is it fast? Is it slow? Do rivers cover the stream or only fringe the bank? All these elements contribute to the suitability of that location for different species of fish. We find that Chinook salmon, the largest Pacific salmon, tend to spawn and their juveniles rear in the lower portion of river systems. This compares with cutthroat trout, a native species with diverse life histories that can include both resident fluvial, adfluvial, and anadromous forms. These fish tend to occupy the smallest and fastest habitats in the headwaters, but different life stages can be found throughout the river network. Rainbow trout, steelhead being their anadromous life history, are also adapted to faster water environments, while coho salmon tend to prefer slower water and pools. Altogether, the types of habitat and where you would find them define how fish are distributed in the river system. All of this relies on the ability of fishes to be able to access different locations in the river. And this access is defined by the physical template of the river, but also by the seasons of the year and the presence or absence of water. Water availability in the form of river flow over time is a crucial aspect of river connectivity. In a typical year, rivers are dynamic between seasons. Even in rivers that are strongly groundwater influenced, there are still changes in the amount of water in the river flow that's linked to patterns of precipitation. More extreme drought and flood events expand or contract the lateral connections between rivers and their floodplains. Daily fluctuations associated with tides characterize the lower reaches of rivers into estuarine areas. So dynamic conditions characterize rivers and provide connection or disconnection between habitats over time. An important characteristic of changes in river flow for aquatic biota is their relative predictability. So in this hydrograph from a rain-dominated coastal stream in Oregon, the pattern of high, flashy winter flows and summer low flows carries over time. The variation is in the range of high flows or the range of low flows. The predictability of the pattern that connects or disconnects headwater and floodplain habitats is something that aquatic biota can be adapted to. Likewise, patterns of stream temperature are predictable, with high temperatures occurring in the summer and low ones in the winter. As with discharge, variability in the extremes is present, but the overall pattern through time is similar and provides a framework to which native species can adapt. Adaptation to cyclical events for plant and animal life is the focus of the study of phenology. For aquatic biota, precipitation, temperature, flow, salinity, sediment, and food all fall into predictable cyclical patterns associated with seasons. Life history transitions for many aquatic species relies on this predictability, thereby attuning their lives to the patterns of connection and disconnection in the river network. If we think about seasonal water availability, we see that in different seasons, water is present or not present in different areas. In this diagram of a rain-dominated river, we see that in the spring, headwater areas have water and floodplain environments are inundated. This compares with summer when headwaters become intermittent and there's less access to floodplains. It is not until winter that we see the broad distribution of water again throughout the river network. When we overlay how fishes use the river system, we can see that different places become accessible over time. In this instance, I am showing habitats for coho salmon and anadromous Pacific salmon that requires spawning habitat for adults and seasonal rearing habitat for juveniles for approximately a year before they migrate to the ocean. So in each season, different places in the river network become habitat as predictable patterns of rain cause water levels to rise or fall. In this way, time connects habitat, and the predictability of environmental conditions provides the framework for adaptation by native fishes. Such adaptation to varying river conditions that reflect predictable local patterns of temperature and flow are common in migratory fishes all over the world. So far, we have been reviewing the many ways of thinking about connectivity in rivers over time and space, and what this means for aquatic species. But what about disconnection? Because of the configuration of the river network and the obvious need for aquatic species to stay in water, pathways for connection in rivers are inherently limited. In this regard, simple barriers like dams or culverts that block movement can have disastrous consequences for migratory fishes. These types of permanent barriers are different from the seasonally available habitats that we have been talking about so far that represent predictable seasonal patterns of river flow. Fagan in 2002 demonstrated that river networks are easily fragmented and showed that extinction risk in dendritic metapopulations is higher than for populations that occupy a single thread. Historically then, rivers represented a complex mosaic of habitats reflecting natural processes of flooding and desiccation within a broader landscape of terrestrial disturbance processes such as wildfire. As development has expanded across the country, river floodplains and wetlands are often a target for development. Why would this be? Well, for a start, these areas are flat, and because people need water too. So as rivers have been disconnected from their floodplains, dams have been built for irrigation, flood control, or hydropower, and culverts have been put in place to allow for the construction of roads. So all of these changes the typical, predictable seasonal patterns of river connection and disconnection for aquatic species. The seasonal patterns of inundation that historically characterized a river system are often replaced with permanently inaccessible sections of rivers. So how is connectivity over space and time linked to resilience of aquatic ecosystems and native biota? I think that we need to expand how we think about connectivity in rivers to include seasonality and changes over time. For the remainder of this presentation, I will be focusing on two main elements. The first is to look at the variability within and among populations of aquatic species that confers resilience across space and time. And the second is to explore behaviors of native species that synchronize space and time to create connectivity among habitats for the completion of all life history stages. If we look across the country at both endemism and biodiversity, a clear pattern emerges. The southeastern portion of the US has the highest rates of diversity and endemism for aquatic species. On a geologic timescale, this area has had more limited experience of disturbance in the form of tectonic activity or glaciation compared to other parts of the nation. The result is a concentration of biodiversity in the Southeast. Globally, biodiversity is in decline. The Living Planet Index tracks populations of thousands of vertebrate species and has determined a total decline of 28% has occurred between 1970 and 2008. While biodiversity is in decline in all environments, freshwater biodiversity losses are greater than in marine or terrestrial systems. Stress or disturbance of ecosystems may lead to a tipping point in which enough individual species are lost that a new ecosystem develops. How resilient an ecosystem is to disturbance reflects the ability of the species that comprise it to survive through disturbance events. In the Pacific Northwest, disturbances have shaped aquatic habitat for the past many millennia, right? Sea level rise since the last ice age has inundated many low-lying coastal environments, leaving fjorded river valleys. The Missoula floods essentially scoured the topsoil from Western Washington to deposit it in the now fertile Willamette Valley. Thank you, Washington State. And volcanic eruptions, most recently Mount St. Helens in 1980, are events that occur on long temporal cycles. This compares with disturbances such as wildfire and debris torrents that may have return intervals between tens and hundreds of years. However, all of these natural disturbances have extended recovery intervals following the disturbance event. Not so with anthropogenic disturbances that are both chronic, such as fine sediment from gravel roads, or essentially permanent, like river-spanning dams. Conceptually, the changes in environmental and in-stream conditions over time and across different scales will make different areas more or less productive for native aquatic species through time. This mosaic of stream conditions reflects varying recovery times after disturbances and also allows for diversity of aquatic conditions across the region. This variation in habitat conditions means that areas of highly productive habitat may move around over time at both large and very small spatial extents. Aquatic species that are highly mobile and able to take advantage of the shifting mosaic of high quality environments may be more resilient over time than other species. So in areas like the Pacific Northwest, variability of habitat use that is conferred with movement may allow for survival with shifting environmental conditions, but it also depends on access and connection between and among habitats. Variability of behaviors can be highly attuned to specific local conditions. In this work by Schindler et al. In 2010, sockeye salmon spawn timing in the Wood River system, Alaska, was highly attuned to different freshwater environments. So stream spawning tended to occur first, followed by rivers, and finally lakes. Variability in spawn timing within different types of environments was high, but the alignment between different freshwater environments and spawn timing is clear. In other river systems, variability in migration timing among locations likely reflects differences in watershed size and the lengths that must be traveled. For salmon returning from marine environments, the need to time river entry to ensure arrival at spawning grounds when conditions of river temperature and discharge are favorable requires strong local adaptation to predictable environmental conditions. Populations with longer distances to travel will likely need to enter rivers earlier in order to migrate to their destination, compared with individuals in rivers with short migration distances. At 3 sites on the Columbia River, the Willamette River, a tributary of the Columbia, and the Umpqua River, long-term data sets of upriver fish movement are available. So in this pie-shaped figure, we have plotted time continuously throughout the year so we can overlay multiple years together. Each dot represents the number of individuals that passed upstream at that site on that day. So coho salmon on the Columbia River in yellow began migrations first. These fishes had the longest distance to traverse before arriving at their spawning grounds. Coho on the Willamette in pink have a shorter distance, and fishes on the Umpqua in black have the shortest migration distance of them all. Pacific lamprey, another anadromous fish with a long juvenile freshwater residency, could be found migrating for an extended period of time in the large Columbia River in black, but for a shorter time in the much smaller Umpqua River system in red. The diverse life stages of Chinook salmon are evident in all 3 river systems, with fishes making upstream migrations for much of the year. Perhaps the most interesting pattern of upriver migrations belongs to steelhead, the anadromous life history of rainbow trout. These fishes are found in all of the rivers throughout the year, with larger pulses of movement associated with winter and fall run populations. So long-term data sets such as these can allow us to understand the spatial context of river use and timing associated with systems of differing sizes. The local adaptation to habitat conditions and the link to habitats as they change seasonally can be interpreted from these types of data sets. Adaptations of the community of fishes to river conditions can sometimes resemble a timeshare condo. At Winchester Dam on the North Umpqua River in Oregon, all fish passing the dam have been counted for decades. In this raster graphic, we have plotted the number of fish moving past the dam on every day. Each little slice of color represents a day, and the darkness of that color captures low to high numbers of individuals, with darker being higher. We start the year in January across the top, with the years of data represented on the left. In the top 2 figures, we have flow and temperature. The seasonal predictability of high flow and low temperatures in the fall and winter months clearly transition to low flow and high temperatures in the summer. Against this backdrop, we can compare the upriver movement timing of different species of native fishes in this system. The migration of adult coho salmon to spawn has the most narrow run timing, likely because these fishes return from the ocean ripe. Cutthroat can be found in the river all year, but a pulse of fishes moves past the dam at the beginning of summer, perhaps to escape warm water temperatures lower in the river system. Lamprey also migrate at this time. The 2 pulses of Chinook, with a larger pulse in the spring followed by a smaller pulse in the fall, show that Chinook are moving upstream much of the year. Suckers appear to move upstream in the spring, while steelhead are moving upstream all year. The darker concentrations of steelhead align with movement of winter and summer populations of fishes. So over time then, we can see different fishes adapted to different characteristics of temperature and discharge at different seasons of the year, as they almost take turns using the river for movement. In an effort to visualize long-term data sets of temperature and discharge, we worked to create something we are calling an ichthyograph. If you plot temperature and discharge against one another, a repeating pattern is present. If we then overlay the time of year that fish are present in a river system, or during a specific life stage, we can create a conceptual model of species or life stages. This predictability of fish use in different locations within a river system can be used for predictive analysis or to determine the variability of behaviors currently expressed by native fishes. This can be helpful when assessing the effect of disturbance, water regulation through dams, or climate change. We've been talking so far about behaviors of fishes that link habitats in one place or throughout a river system. So what does disconnection mean for native fishes that synchronize temporally available habitats across a river network? Disconnection can be caused by historic forest practices like splash dams, modern water withdrawal for agriculture, or other anthropogenic uses like dams. But this begs the question, is a barrier to movement always a barrier to movement? Sometimes human barriers under specific conditions, such as floods, are not barriers to movement at all. Here, chum salmon cross a river flooded by the Skokomish River in Washington state. Low flow from agricultural withdrawal may cause a thermal or flow barrier in summer, but that river will be accessible with the return of seasonal precipitation. Culverts may block passage by adults or juveniles during low or high flows, but may be passable at other times. How these unnatural barriers modify connection and disconnection within the broader context of seasonal river flows will affect different species in different ways. As we saw at Winchester Dam, different species and life stages will be occupying different parts of the river system over time. The modifications to connection and habitat quality created by unnatural barriers may cause significant problems for some species and limited issues for others. When we start to consider the distribution of native fishes, the presence of natural and unnatural barriers and flow levels are critical in the evaluation of areas of potential habitat. For us in the Pacific Northwest, riparian protections are tied to land ownership and the presence or absence of fishes. If the upper limit in the distribution of native fish was evaluated in a year with high summer flows, or in a year after a major flood event, the distribution of fishes will be high in the system. But if evaluations of the upper limit of fishes is done in a low water summer, without a major flood event that provides great connection in headwater areas, the area occupied by fishes will be lower. There are also differences among different methods of detecting fish. In this study by my colleague Brooke Penaluna, she found that water samples of environmental DNA tended to detect trout higher in the river system than more traditional backpack electrofishing. The implications of potentially intermittent downstream barriers to fish movement that rely principally on river flow levels can have incredibly important implications for riparian protections, particularly in headwater areas. The concept of connection is also critical when considering how genes flow within a population in a river network. Riverscape genetics works to incorporate the configuration of the river network into assessments of gene flow and the spatial genetic structure of a population. A highly connected population, as we see in the blue circles in Figure A, may have more avenues for complexity and resilience than a less connected population depicted in Figure B. How organisms can move around in a river system is critical to understanding the potential for isolation and resilience in the face of disturbance. A significant disturbance that may directly affect phenology and adaptation to environmental conditions in aquatic ecosystems is climate change. These figures show the difference in average precipitation and temperature in the US between the time period 1901 through 1960 compared with the time period 1991 to 2012. In the figure in the lower left, darker green is associated with increases in precipitation, while darker brown is associated with decreases in precipitation. In the figure in the upper right, dark red is associated with increases in temperature, while dark blue indicates cooler temperatures. Across the US, change in both temperature and precipitation is clearly not something to just expect in the future. It is something that has been happening for some time. So how do the changes in precipitation and temperature associated with climate change affect the phenology of aquatic species? That's an incredibly important and timely question. So being able to characterize the amount of variation currently present in populations of fishes can contribute to our predictions of resilience under future conditions. Temperature and discharge create variable conditions for specific life stages of any species. As we have reviewed, time links spatial habitat as seasons change. In this example, the minimum discharge and thermal threshold for migration and spawning of coho salmon is highlighted. Should this envelope of conditions shift, will there still be alignment between ideal spawn timing and emergence of gravel eggs from the gravel later in the year? Shifts in phenology of upstream migration by spring chinook and sockeye salmon have already been documented. In this work by Crozier et al. In 2008, she documented earlier run timing in both species, possibly in response to high July temperatures that reduce survivorship through direct mortality and higher prevalence of disease. The adaptability of fishes to changes in conditions that allow for habitat connectivity is important in assessments of resilience. So here we have another ichthyograph from Winchester Dam on the North Umpqua River in Oregon, in which we mapped the empirical movement data directly onto this base of temperature and discharge. We were interested in exploring how currently expressed behavioral variation in upstream migrating adult coho salmon aligned with ranges of temperature and discharge. We mapped the percentiles of fish movement, highlighting the 1st through the 5th and the 95th to the 99th percentiles of the run. We were particularly interested in these tails of the distribution because we anticipated that they may be most affected by predicted changes in climate. We modeled predicted future discharge levels and compared them to current flow to determine if and when we would see increases, as shown here, or decreases. We also outlined the current range of temperature and discharge conditions to which these fishes were currently expressing adaptation through their movements. We were also interested in how behavioral variation may make the same species more or less vulnerable to projected changes in discharge and temperature throughout their range. So we did the same exercise at 3 other locations. at Willamette Falls on the Willamette River, at Bonneville Dam on the Columbia, and at Ice Harbor Dam on the Snake. So in the top figure is the Winchester Dam plot of temperature and discharge that I just showed you and explained. And in the lower figures, you will see the other sites that we were mapping for this effort. You can see that the shape, while repetitive at the other sites, isn't the triangle we saw at Winchester Dam. These differences in shape primarily reflect the difference between rain and snow-dominated hydrologies. In this second figure, we again have the percentiles of the run at Winchester Dam on the top, and you can see that the timing of main stem fish migration at each site for migrating adult coho salmon is quite variable. This reflects the influence of hatchery stocks at some locations and the distance that fishes will likely need to migrate to reach spawning grounds in others. It also indicates that coho salmon may be more or less vulnerable to changes in future hydrographs, depending on where they are. And what we saw when we modeled predicted future conditions was consistent with this hypothesis. While only early returning coho salmon appear to overlap with changes in the hydrograph at Winchester Dam, the entire run of fishes will be affected by lower flow conditions at Bonneville. Interestingly, fishes at Ice Harbor will be migrating during the short window in which we do not predict changes in the hydrograph. The context for this, however, is that the fishes at Ice Harbor Dam must pass through Bonneville before they get to this location. This series of ichthyographs only shows upriver migration. Out-migrating smolts or other life stages will experience different river conditions and vulnerabilities as well. So climate change is also predicted to result in more extreme temperature and precipitation events into the future. For strong swimmers, flood events may offer opportunities to expand their ranges or to colonize areas that were previously inaccessible. Drought, on the other hand, could significantly hamper survival throughout river systems. Safik et al. In 2012 found that trends in discharge of both rain and snow-dominated systems are strongly influenced by both climate and lithology. So rivers with more groundwater showed less variation in response to climate compared with surface flow-dominated systems. This was the case in both rain and snow-dominated hydrologic regimes. In this Arizmendi et al. 2013 publication, the authors found that there was a shift in the amount of time between extreme flow events and higher stream temperature events. In their study, they found that the number of days between extreme low flow and high thermal conditions was getting shorter. And this implies that the experience of aquatic fishes to stressful summer river conditions is getting more intense. For anadromous species, climate change effects will not only occur in fresh water. Predicted changes in estuaries from sea level rise and storm surges modify lower river salinity and the distribution of estuarine habitats. Ocean conditions will also modify the times of the year when the conditions are more or less productive for migrating fishes. So the delicate linkages in predictable conditions that connect habitats from the ocean to the headwaters of rivers will change in different ways, complicating necessary adaptations of fishes that move between freshwater, estuarine, and marine environments. Black et al. In 2018 demonstrated the strong synchrony among annual river discharge, winter sea levels, winter upwelling, winter precipitation, and the North Pacific high. What's important to see here is the similarity in conditions across all of these variables. This means that even inland, marine conditions and coastal draining streams are strongly linked to the marine environment. For fishes that live exclusively in fresh water, this link to marine systems then is still strong. So for anadromous fishes, the linkages are direct between freshwater, estuary, and marine environments. In a recent review that we conducted on publications documenting habitat connectivity for Pacific salmon in freshwater, estuary, or marine environments, we found that research into freshwater habitats was vastly more common. Very little work was available that documented habitat connectivity in the marine environment or that linked habitats from freshwater to the ocean. Most Pacific salmon spend the majority of their life in marine settings, so the lack of research about marine habitats, dispersal, movement, or habitat use is an impediment to management of these often imperiled fishes. So I'm coming back to our original kind of two questions here. How is connectivity over space and time linked to the resilience of aquatic ecosystems and native biota? Well, I think the answer is it's complicated. The seasonality of river flow conditions intersects with the life history adaptations of aquatic species to create a complex interaction between the physical and biological environment. Variability within and among populations, as well as diversity of behaviors, may result in resilience for some species in some circumstances. As we explore the interaction between native fish throughout a river system and human uses of those systems, considerations about the complexity and connectivity of seasonally available habitat is critical. A broader definition of connectivity that includes time, that includes expansion and contraction throughout river systems, and that sees potential opportunities for aquatic species in events like floods, are important to rebuild resilience into rivers. The habitat needs of the diverse aquatic biota that depend on predictable but now changing hydrologic conditions will likely require us to rethink how we plan for and use our rivers, riparian, and floodplain areas in the future. And with that, I'd just like to thank you for the invitation to be here, Ray, and to open this up for any questions from the chat or for people jumping in. So thank you so very much.
And thank you very much, Rebecca. That's what you've presented shows a tremendous number of results from many studies in complex situations, and a lot for us to think about in our work, particularly where it involves movement of fishes. Eric, what do we have for hands up and comments here?
We are waiting for someone to unmute themselves with a question. I don't know if Ray, if you had a question based on that too.
Well, it's, as I say, it's a tremendous amount of information, and it went over, it related to many aspects of what we have to deal with in fisheries. I thought it was particularly interesting to have Rebecca mention that aquatic organisms, particularly those in streams, are very restricted, and people often don't take that into account. You know, they say, well, if conditions are bad, why don't the fish just go? Why doesn't the animal just go someplace else? Well, with fishes, it's hard to do. They're more mobile than mollusks, for instance, and that's shows the difference between the amount of endangered invertebrates. It's much worse than with fish, but still, with fish, we've got big problems.
That's true. And, thinking about the theme of this meeting about trout stream restoration, about renewal, something that I would just highlight in terms of these concepts that I've been talking about, the connectivity within the river system and the seasonality of that connectivity, is that thinking broadly about barriers and where the barriers are that we're replacing in a river system, how we decide to replace barriers or move them, as we're moving forward in our restoration, I think is really important. I know I work with a lot of watershed groups here, and often restoration is pragmatic, and we do stream restoration in places where we have landowners who are willing to do restoration, where we have landowners who are willing to replace a barrier culvert. But if there are 3 more barrier culverts downstream and you have an anadromous population of fishes, is that a useful place for us to target restoration? So thinking about the entire context of barriers, particularly for culvert and dam removal and replacement, and the life histories of the fishes that you're working with. Are they anadromous fishes? Are they resident? When we start to prioritize how to place restoration actions, especially when they're going to be expensive ones.
Well, thank you very much. Any further questions here? Unmute yourselves and speak up if there are. If not, we're into a break session, and we'll see you back at what is it? 6:35 here. It should be 8:35 for the Midwesterners.
8:35, correct. So we have Eric Booth on deck, and he is in our meeting space. We'll just take a small break so people can use the restroom or go get a beverage, and come back and hear about grass versus trees.
And just to chat a bit during the break, we're having another hot spell out here in the Seattle area where I live. It's very, very unusual. When we moved here 30-some years ago, if it got up to 80 degrees, that was front page news. Now it gets over 80 degrees a lot. And but several weeks ago, we had temperatures up into the hundreds near the coast. And that's extremely unusual. And today it's supposed to be 91. And I believe it from where I sit on the west side of my house, soaking up the sunlight. And tomorrow it's supposed to be 95 or greater.
Yeah, I certainly hope people are taking care of their health during the hot weather. I know in Milwaukee right now, there's still about 30,000 customers without power from a storm that came through 2 days ago. So we're working on getting people reconnected to the energy grid. Fortunately, we've got some cooler weather going on here. I can show you real quick. See if this will work while we're on the break. Ray, our central Wisconsin region has gotten plenty of rain. It's running pretty good on the Wisconsin River here. So this is looking outside my backyard. It's an island on the far side of the stream there, or the river. But we're at 20,000 cubic feet per second on the Wisconsin River, right in Stevens Point.
So you're out there measuring it, are you?
No, I'm fortunate that the dams on the system need to report out their daily flow levels. And so I can look at that, and I can look at the USGS gauge stations. Downstream, it's at Wisconsin Rapids, and upstream, there's one at Lake Dubay Dam just up from Stevens Point. Can't get this video to play, but
the early part of the summer in Wisconsin was pretty darn dry, wasn't it?
Yeah, it started out, I think, a little drier than normal. We've definitely caught up. I just saw an interesting graphic that was from the USGS that summarized the month of July for all 50 states across all gauging stations by day of the month. So all one graphic that just showed a giant map of the United States and all the gauge stations. And it did start out a little low, but then we certainly ended on a much wetter spell. And Minnesota to the west is suffering right now. I think they're approaching record levels of drought in Minnesota.
Well, I visited Wisconsin near where you live, Eric, starting the what was it, the 29th of June. And a couple days before that, they got 4 inches of rain. But before that, they told me it had been awfully dry. And I stayed there for about 3 weeks. And it was only in the last 2 days or so that we started to have mosquitoes where I was. I mean, usually in the summer, they've got humid air and mosquitoes all summer long. But I was wondering if the dry spell early in the summer was enough to kill all the juvenile stages of the mosquito, or the in-stream stages, the eggs and the pupae and so on.
Yeah, we got a pretty good crop going right now.
Yeah.
It wasn't too bad earlier in the summer, though.
No, that's right. That's right. Makes you wonder why.
Yep.
They're going now. There you go.
So Eric, you showed up. I'm glad you
Yeah, sorry, I
made
was
it.
a little late.
You're not late. You're on time.
So that's the Wisconsin River.
But yeah, that's moving.
Are you taking that picture as we speak?
No, I got out there this afternoon. This is
Oh,
right
that's-
in my backyard.
Uh-huh.
20,000 is quite a bit. That was upstream to the dam. The river by my house maxes out at about 60,000 when we get intense rains or snowmelt. All right, we're back on time now. Let me,
Good enough. Got like 1 minute to go, right?
yeah, I think so. I'm reading 836 here.
Okay. No. Mine says 34, but we'll average that. So our speaker now will be Eric Booth.